If you've been following along with us in this lecture series, we've talked about the causation of World War II. We've talked about the impact that World War II had on the American home front. The one thing that we haven't done is fought the actual war, and that's what I want to do with you here today. Before we go any further, what I want to do is to make sure that you understand who is playing on what team. And to give you an idea about that, the first term that I want to introduce you to would be the Allied powers, what comes to be known as the Grand Alliance. Now, for your notes, the Allied powers are featured right there if you're following along with me on the PowerPoint. At least one of those guys will look pretty familiar, the guy in the middle. The Allied powers consist of the United States, and it should not come as a surprise to anyone that our ally, our primary ally, is the Great Britain. We know that Franklin Roosevelt had desperately been trying to get Britain to hang on, and so if you're looking at that image there, the man to Roosevelt's left, Roosevelt's there in the middle, that'd be the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. It's pretty natural that the United States would team up with Great Britain, lots in common, both democracies, all of that sort of thing. The guy to FDR's right, or our right, his left, that would be the premier of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union would comprise the last of the Allied powers. Now, working with the Soviets is going to be a little bit more challenging than the British for a lot of reasons, most of which you're going to find out here in a second. But those are the Allied powers: the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. And one thing I want to make clear very early on is each brings some unique advantage to the table when it comes to fighting this war. What the United States brings is an unimaginable capacity to produce. We talked about this the last time we met. What the British bring would be control of the seas, in particular the Atlantic and the North Sea. That's really advantageous. And what the Russians bring, what the Soviets bring, is manpower, enormous amounts of manpower. So when you combine all of these three things, this is a really formidable force. You'll see what I mean here in a minute. For right now, I want to talk about the bad guys. I want to talk about the Axis powers. And central in these Axis powers would be Nazi Germany. Okay? If you followed along with us the last time, you know that Germany had an alliance with not only Benito Mussolini and Italy, but also fascist Japan as well. And so together, these three powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, they're going to comprise the Axis powers. So we now have all of the teams settled. Now I want to explain to you why it's so difficult working with the Soviet Union. The most obvious explanation is because they were a communist nation, right? We had had red scares in this country before, and so working with a communist-controlled country was a difficult sell to the American people in and of itself. But probably even more difficult would be Joseph Stalin, the guy that's leading the Soviet Union. Listen, in a lot of ways, Stalin made Adolf Hitler look like a choir boy when it comes to his bloody reign of terror. Killed a lot more people than Hitler. Primary reason why is that he ruled over the Soviet Union for a long time, a lot more time rather than Hitler ruled over Germany. But he was a brutal, brutal dictator, and we were very aware of what was going on in the Soviet Union. It's not like this is a secret. But probably the worst thing of all was that Stalin was not very shy, let alone quiet, about what he wanted to get out of this war. I mean, even before the bullets really started flying with World War II, when Germany made the really bad decision to invade the Soviet Union, he's already talking about concessions, what he wants, ports, territories, colonies, whatever it is that you want to call it. He's already basically making these demands. And so what Franklin Roosevelt more or less does is kind of tries to get him to keep that all on the down low because we need the Soviet Union. We need the Soviet Union for the same reason that France needed Russia in the First World War. It's going to put Germany right there in the middle. It's going to force them to fight a two-front war. And if you know anything about the history of World War II, it's really 1942, 1943 that the tide begins to turn, and much of it had to do with Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union, and much of his army just simply does not come back. But in any case, I need you to understand that this is not exactly a slam dunk of an alliance. It's difficult to work with the Soviets. Let me give you one explanation as to why. We are going to settle on what ultimately comes to be known as a Germany first strategy. We know that it was the Japanese that had launched the United States into the war. It wasn't Germany. Germany declared war on us in the aftermath of all of this. We perceived Germany to be the stronger enemy. And it was really the British that got in our ears, so to speak, and said we need to defeat the Germans first and then focus all of our attention on the Japanese. What we really have to do is help alleviate much of the suffering of the Soviet Union. They had kept the German hands full for the longest of times, but they had massive amounts of casualties, and Stalin was begging us to open a second front and invade Normandy, invade France to get back on the continent. That was originally scheduled for 1942, 1943. And if you know anything about the history of the D-Day invasion, you'll know that it doesn't come until 1944. And so this is deep, deep, deep into the war. And it's a lot of the reason why is because Franklin Roosevelt, at the end of the day, agreed with Winston Churchill that we needed to go right through the middle of Europe, come up from Africa into Italy, and clear out the Axis powers in the Mediterranean before we invaded Northwest Europe, right? But in 1945, we'll see the meeting of the minds once again. As a matter of fact, the Yalta Conference is going to be one of the last meetings of the Big Three. And what gets decided at Yalta in February 1945 is that the Soviet Union would help us with the Japanese after we get the Nazis to surrender. In other words, this Germany first strategy, we are going to defeat the Germans, and then as a return the favor sort of phenomenon, we're going to see the Soviet Union help us gang up and finish off the Japanese. This move was designed to save American lives. It was designed to corner the Japanese. It was designed to bring the war to a very abrupt end. We'll talk more about that here in just a minute, but for right now, there's one thing that I want to make sure that you understand before we move along. We talked about this a little bit in the last lecture. Franklin Roosevelt had run for an unprecedented third term as president, and he had won. He won in 1940. He's going to run again in 1944, and once again, he will win, making this his fourth unprecedented in American history, fourth term as the U.S. president. He's been president for a very, very long time. But the thing about FDR is in 1944, he was a very sick man. And his days are very clearly numbered, as you're going to find out here in a moment. The only person that really felt that Franklin Roosevelt was going to live to see the end of the war was Franklin Roosevelt. He was suffering from what doctors diagnosed as an enlarged heart. And it becomes very, very noticeable to anybody that's paying attention around him. And one of the things that they're going to do in 1944 is take down the current vice president, a guy by the name of Henry Wallace, and they will replace him with a guy that will later become president of the United States, Harry S. Truman. And we'll talk about Truman a little bit later, but I need you to understand that Roosevelt is going to die in April 1945, right when American troops are on the outskirts of Berlin and the war is rapidly coming to a close, at least in Europe. And so Roosevelt doesn't live to see the end of the war. Much of this is going to fall onto the shoulders of Harry Truman. But before we go any further, I want to make sure that we talk about what this post-war world is going to look like, because as you're going to find out, the post-war world is even as important as the war itself. In Western Europe, the Americans and the British had done most of the fighting and most of the dying, and so we could expect to have a very heavy hand in reshaping that part of Europe. Now, we knew what we wanted. We wanted to prevent wars like this from ever occurring again. And we felt that the best way to do this would be to rebuild Western Europe in a democratic fashion. You export democracies. When you have democracy, it'll make it really difficult for the Hitlers and the Mussolinis to rise to power. So we wanted to rebuild a democratic Europe. In the eastern part of Europe, in Romania, in Hungary, in Poland, and even in Germany, it was the Soviets that had done the fighting and the dying. And they want to prevent wars like this from happening as well, but they don't see democracy as the key to that. They see communism. They want to export communism. This is going to come to be known as the Cold War, and you'll understand exactly what that means here in a few minutes. But for right now, much of what is decided as far as how Europe is going to look in the aftermath of the war is really going to be based on that conference at Yalta. Franklin Roosevelt, right before he died, is more or less going to give the Soviet Union its own sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. What's going to happen is those countries are going to be liberated by the Soviets. The problem is that Red Army, the Soviet Union's armies, just never really go home. It's more or less an occupation. And again, you'll see what I mean here in a second. But from the outside looking in, it looks like what Joseph Stalin is interested in doing is getting his hands on every single scrap of territory, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, wherever it is that you want to talk about. He wants as much land as he can possibly get his hands on. One final example, if you'll indulge me. The big problem when it comes to, you know, what Germany is going to look like is that not only had every country fought against Germany, every country had fought against Germany on German soil. And so what happens to Germany in the aftermath of the war is it gets divided into four quarters. Now, the idea here is we're going to rehabilitate Germany. The United States is going to take a corner. The British are going to take a corner. The French, who had helped us to fight our way into Germany at this point, they're going to take a corner. And the Soviet Union is going to take a corner as well. The idea here is teamwork. More hands is better than fewer hands. And the goal is to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And so we go ahead and we put our chunk back in, and the British put their chunk back in, and even the French put their chunk back in. And as you might have guessed, the Soviet Union never puts their piece of the pie back. And this is before many of you will remember, but once upon a time, there used to be two different Germanys. There was a Western Germany, which was much bigger. If you looked at a map, it would appear bigger. And it was democratic, small d democratic. And then you had a much smaller Eastern Germany, which was a communist country for a long, long time in the aftermath of World War II. And part of the reason for this is that the Soviets just simply never went home. And so what happens in Eastern Germany really does become reflective when it comes to the attitudes that most Americans are going to have as far as what the Soviet Union's up to and what the post-war goals that Joseph Stalin might have, right? Long story short, the Soviet Union looks like the new bad guys in the world, new enemies of democracy. But for right now, I want to turn our attention to the Pacific theater. What's going to happen in the Pacific is that the Navy and the Marine Corps are going to shoulder the brunt of the load when it comes to reclaiming those islands that comprise the Japanese war years empire. Now, as I mentioned of a minute ago, we perceived Germany to be the stronger enemy. That's probably pretty fair. Germany's economy was bigger, was more robust, it had access to more natural resources. It's probably pretty fair to say that Germany was, in fact, the stronger enemy. Japan's the tougher enemy. There's no question about that. Whereas the Germans will surrender when they can see you've got them surrounded, the Japanese are going to fight you to the last man. There's a really good movie. I like it anyway. It was directed by Clint Eastwood. It's called Letters from Iwo Jima. And there's a scene in that movie where these Japanese soldiers know that they're about to be taken prisoner. And what they do is they commit suicide. They hold grenades up to their chest and blow themselves up rather than to, in their own minds anyway, suffer the humiliation of being taken prisoner by the enemy. And so Japan's the tougher enemy in the sense that they're not going to surrender politely. They are going to fight you to the last man. By 1945. Clearly, there was no way that the Japanese were going to win. Um, we had really begun to turn the tide, I guess you could say as early as 1942. The Americans are on the offensive and the Japanese are going to be on the defensive. And we begin to push into the islands that surround the Japanese mainland. Probably the most famous of these battles is going to be Iwo Jima. Again, if you're following along with me, that image at the top of the slide there with those Marines hoisting that flag, that might look familiar to you in the sense that that is probably the symbol of not only the Battle of Iwo Jima in the Pacific, the first of the Japanese islands that was considered its mainland, but in any case, it's reflective of the whole war. The problem that we've got is that Japan refuses to surrender unconditionally. That leaves us with three options. One, we can invade the Japanese mainland, Tokyo, and suffer absolutely horrendous casualties. Not only American casualties, but Japanese civilian casualties as well. We could surround the islands of Japan and blockade them. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out, starve them out. Another not so great alternative. The last alternative involved technology and weaponry that was being developed in the American West under the code name of the Manhattan Project. Now, for your notes, what the Manhattan Project was the code name for the atomic bomb. It was a weapon of mass destruction that both the American and British governments had put a lot of time and resources into in an attempt to end the war and end the war quickly. What we are going to say to Japan after we've successfully tested one of these bombs, we're going to tell them to surrender unconditionally or face utter annihilation. And they refused. And so what we do is we use the Enola Gay there. You're looking at that on the screen. We fly the Enola Gay over Hiroshima and we drop the first ever nuclear bomb in world history. And once again, we repeated our demand. Surrender unconditionally or face utter annihilation. And they went radio silent. So less than a week later, we're going to drop another atomic bomb on the port city of Nagasaki. And in the aftermath of that second bomb, the Japanese surrendered unconditionally. That is what is going to bring Japan to the table, the psychological element that if they've got two atomic bombs, might they have three? And if they've got three atomic bombs, might they have four, five? How many Japanese cities? We're no longer talking about chunks of Tokyo. How many entire cities, regions even, are we willing to basically sacrifice when we're clearly not going to win the war? There's another reason that we're being so proactive with our use of the atomic bomb. And a lot of it has to do with that agreement that was hammered out with the Soviets at Yalta. Remember, the Soviet Union, once the Germans had surrendered, they were going to come in and they were going to help us out with the Japanese. But we looked around at what the Soviets were doing in Eastern Europe, liberating these countries only never to leave. We desperately did not want that for Eastern Asia. And so one of the motivations that we have in getting Japan to surrender quickly is we can tell the Soviets there's no need for you to come over here. You guys can just stay there in Moscow and we'll call you if we need you. And that's essentially what happens. We don't require that Soviet help that we had agreed to at Yalta. And so that is another very motivating factor when it comes to our decision to use the atomic bomb. What I want to talk about now is the formation of the United Nations. And if you recall from that lecture on World War I had made mention that there was this move, that one of Wilson's 14 points was to create this international coalition of countries that he called the League of Nations, to get out in front of these big problems before they become full-fledged wars, put pressure on countries like Germany in this case. Ultimately, the League of Nations never really happened. The United States never, in fact, joined. And in the middle of World War II, we began to see these ideas, these talks, they begin to come about again. In August of 1943, at what comes to be known as the Quebec Conference, you get Secretary of State Cordell Hull and the British Secretary of Foreign Secretary, that is, Anthony Eden, that begin to discuss the possibilities and the prospects to create this international organization of numerous different countries that would have co-equal status to diffuse tense, tension-filled situations before they become, full-scale wars. This is what comes to be known as the United Nations. And the purpose of the United Nations is going to be to enforce the peace. The original members of the United Nations are going to consist of the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. And if you know anything about the UN today, you'll know that it includes dozens and dozens of nations from all around the globe, right? Now, what these nations will do, if there ever is a crisis or even talks that need to be held, they will send delegates. For your notes, the first American delegate to the UN is going to be none other than Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a brilliant, brilliant selection as a representative, considering she had long been an advocate for what you and I would call human rights. She had long been an advocate for peace. And she was still very, very active and would remain very active in politics even after the death of her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Right? But speaking of the death of FDR, all of this is going to fall onto the shoulders, not only rounding out the war months, really, but inheriting this post-war situation. That would be Harry S. Truman. He's going to become president in the aftermath of FDR's death. And his big charge, his big question mark, if you will, how do you get the Soviet Union under control? You've got this Soviet Union, they seem to be the new bad guys of democracy. They're out there trying to get their hands on every scrap of land and territory that they can. How do you get them to stop doing that? And one of the ways that Truman at least attempted was what comes to be known as nuclear diplomacy. He begins to insinuate, not fully threaten, but certainly insinuate that we were not above the use of military atomic strikes, if you will. But the problem with that is that the tougher that we got with the Soviets, the more bent than ever than they seemed on world domination. And so what's Harry Truman to do? In the aftermath of the war, Winston Churchill, who was not reelected as prime minister, he comes over to the United States, and in Fulton, Missouri, he delivers his speech, and in it he coins this term, the Iron Curtain. And what he meant by this Iron Curtain, that all along in Central and Eastern Europe, you're beginning to see this unmistakable Soviet military presence. And the Soviets are walling off Eastern and Central Europe from the rest of the continent, from the rest of the world, really. And what Churchill insinuated was that, much like Hitler, Joseph Stalin was not really going to be happy until he was master of all of Europe. That just like with Hitler, you cannot play the appeasement game. He's saying you can't play that game with a dictator like Joseph Stalin either. Now, once again, if you're looking at this PowerPoint, that's a political cartoon, and it's Joseph Stalin on there. And if you look closely, what he's doing is he's planting those Soviet flags all around Eastern Europe. But look at France, look at Sweden. What's on top of those? What's on top of those countries? And it's a question mark. In other words, are those countries next? Truman needs to get out in front of this. And so what he's going to do in 1947 is he's going to issue this concept that comes to be known as the Truman Doctrine. There's two parts to the Truman Doctrine that I need you to be mindful of. Part of what Truman promised was that we would pay any price necessary, pay any price we had to, if it meant preventing the spread of communism. Truman believed that radicalism, including communism, spread when people didn't have enough food, when they didn't have any jobs, when they were miserable. After all, that's what brought Hitler to power. He also said that we would fight any war. We would not back down. If the Soviets were threatening to overrun the western part of Germany, we would stand up and we would fight them. So taken collectively, we will pay any price and we will fight any war if it means standing up to and stopping the spread of communism. Now, two nations that have been absolutely leveled by the war, Greece and Turkey in southeastern Europe. And what Harry Truman's going to do is he's going to go to Congress and he's going to get a $400 billion stimulus package to rebuild the countries of both Greece and Turkey. And we do. We build roads and we build schools and hospitals and pretty soon people have jobs. And when we went ahead and we restored the Greek and the Turkish economies, not only did they become our friends, but the appeal of communism, the appeal of going to an extreme form of government like even socialism, it really, really lessened. I always think of it like this. If you need to go to work and make money by 9 o'clock, you really don't have too much time to stop and talk to the extremists. It worked like a charm. As a matter of fact, it worked so well that Truman says, what the hey, let's do that for all of Europe. He introduced this Reconstruction concept known as the Marshall Plan. It was named after the Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, and what it did was it invited all European countries, including the Soviet Union, to participate in an American-sponsored reconstruction program to rebuild the continent, to do for all of Europe what the Americans had done in Greece and Turkey. And initially, the Soviets go along with it. And then at the 11th hour, Stalin felt that he was being set up. And so what he says is, not only are we not going to participate, but no country within our sphere of influence, within our orbit, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, you will not participate either. And so the Americans go forward with the Marshall Plan, and money gets pumped into France, and it gets pumped into Italy, Western Germany, Britain, Sweden. And what they become is little sparkling mini Americas. People have jobs, schools are being built, the economies begin coming back. They're coming back slowly, but they're very clearly coming back. What you've got in Eastern Europe is smoldering rubble, because on its very best day, the Soviet Union simply could not sniff the economy that was the United States. It couldn't afford to do what we were doing. And it's going to be years, decades really, before you'll see Eastern Europe really begin to kind of rebuild in the aftermath of World War II. This brings up all kinds of different issues, but it's ultimately going to do two things. I think there's two things that you can point to. Number one, what the Truman Doctrine is going to do is it's going to make our old World War II enemies our new post-war friends. Not only are we going to rebuild the German economy, they're going to be our friends in the process of this, we'll do the same thing for Japan. They become our new post-war World War II friends, allies. The other thing that it's going to do is it's going to lead to this time period that we call the Cold War. And this is very, very important. This is going to define at least the next unit of our class, the Cold War. What the Cold War was an ideological struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States. What we are trying to do is we are trying to export democracy. Democracy in Europe, democracies in these emerging former colonial territories in Africa, in the Far East, in the Americas, in the Middle East. We want those to become democracies because we feel that that's the best way to prevent wars like this from happening. The Soviet Union at least says it's interested in preventing these wars, but it doesn't want to export democracy, it wants to export communism. And so when I say it's an ideological struggle, it's a struggle of ideas. We want democracy, they want communism, and it's a struggle for domination. What country is going to have the upper hand when it comes to this ideological struggle? And as I said before, you're going to see the Cold War flaring up in various points throughout the world. The great irony is you never see the Cold War turn into a hot war, an actual war between the United States and the Soviet Union. But certainly there were people that were sizing up teams, so to speak, in places like Korea, places like Algeria, places like Vietnam, places like Afghanistan. The Cold War will flare up every once in a while, and certainly we'll talk about some of those flare-ups over the course of the next few lectures. For right now, I want to talk to you about 1949, because 1949 was a very bad year for the United States for two very Very important reasons. Here we are, after 1947, proclaiming that we would fight any war, we would pay any price, we just will not see the spread of communism on our watch. And the Chinese go over to communism. A massive country, one of the more populated places on earth, they become a communist government. The civil war in China between Mao Zedong's communist forces and Chiang Kai-shek's American-backed regime is going to end with a communist victory. Our whole way of fighting the Cold War was containing communism where it presently existed. This comes to be known as containment policy. If you contain communism where it already exists, people will hate it, they will rebel against it, and it will die a natural death. And here we are in 1949 with not only a really important country, but a really populated country that has just become a communist country. This is bad news. Even worse, 1949 is the year that the Soviet Union will develop its own nuclear bomb. Before, we could always say, you better back away from this policy or that policy or what have you because we'll, use the bomb. And now what the Soviets can say is that's all fine and well. How do you feel about New York or Washington or San Francisco? You get the idea. We're seeing this Cold War, but the stakes are higher than ever. One of the things that's going to define this time period of the Cold War is the fact that we now, mankind that is, now has the possibility to destroy the world. As a matter of fact, by the mid 1950s, between the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, not only is there enough nuclear weaponry to destroy the world, but we'd still have a few nukes to play around with, even in the aftermath of everything turning into dust. And so this is the world that is going to come out of World War II. And you're going to see it affect basically every single element in American life. You'll see it affected domestically. You'll see it affected culturally, economically, and certainly with respect to our foreign policy. You'll see what I mean as early as our next lecture.